This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'll be taking a look at Noodler's Navy. You'll have to excuse the ink splatter on the label. Another ink from this order sprung a leak. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper in my new Hobonichi Techo that I'm going to be using as my ink journal. I'll look at a writing sample that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper. I'll look at inks from my collection that are comparable to Noodler's Navy. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. Noodler's Navy came off the nib of my glass dip pen nice and uniformly, but as I wrote with it, it seemed to dry out, or it felt like I was running out of ink pretty quickly compared to other inks. Here, after I wrote Noodlers, you can see that it was getting lighter. I just turned the nib and wrote Navy, and already at the end of Navy, you see a difference in the shade of the ink from the beginning to the end of the word. And I'm thinking that must have something to do with how quickly the ink dries. This does seem to be a fairly quick drying ink. The ink swatch that I did with my tweezers was nice and crisp. There's a little bit of shading from the beginning to the end of the swatch. It's a little bit darker here at the very beginning of the swatch. The drip of ink at the end of the ink swatch has just a little bit of pink sheen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G Plus. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. I had high hopes for this extra fine nib with this Noodler's Navy. I've had a few Noodler's inks that performed really well with my extra fine nibs, and this did not disappoint me. The legibility is very good. It puts down a nice crisp line, and it was very nice to write with. It was not scratchy. It was very pleasant. Next, I've got a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. It has a 14 karat gold fine nib. This is a very fine nib, and I tend to have trouble with this pen picking up paper fibers. It's not really to the point of being scratchy, but there is a lot of feedback when writing with this pen, this particular nib, but I didn't get that sensation when writing with this ink. It felt noticeably smoother than normal. I should say there was less feedback than normal. So I wouldn't call it smooth, but it was very nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Legno. It also has a 14 karat fine nib. For these writing tests, I don't ink up the converter. I just dip the pens in ink, and usually that provides me enough ink to get through quite a bit of writing, the writing sample, but I'm going to have to redip this pen. And you can see that when I dip the nibs, the ink does tend to stick to the nib, and this is a quick drying ink. So I wonder how that's going to affect the long-term use. For these writing samples, I'm just testing how the ink feels in the nib, how it feels writing on paper. I won't know how it performs in a converter until I test it long-term. Now, these Pilot nibs are softer than the Sailor gold nibs, and they do put down more ink. Even though I just dipped this, it's not just putting down more ink because I just dipped it. It is a wetter writer, and it is much smoother. This is glassy smooth on the paper. I have a feeling that this would perform better if I did have the converter. Sometimes, this doesn't happen very often, but sometimes when you dip the nib in ink, instead of the capillary action forcing the ink toward the nib as you're writing, if it sets for a little while, the capillary action will actually pull the ink backwards in the pen. And so when I go to clean this pen out, there will be quite a bit of ink up there in the feed. Typically, I see that behavior in my 1.5 stub nib. This is the first time I've seen it in my pilot. Next, I've got a Kaweco Perkeo all black. It has a stainless steel medium nib with a black finish. Usually with this nib, I get like a chalky type feedback. It's not scratchy or unpleasant. It just has a chalky feel to it, but I still consider it smooth. With this ink, I could still hear it writing on the page, but I didn't really feel any feedback. It was very smooth. And I think that chalky feedback may come in part from the finish that's on this nib, because my other Kaweco nibs that are the stainless steel nibs that have like gold plating, or the silver colored stainless steel nibs, are pretty smooth. They're smoother than this one. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel cursive medium nib. It's an unusual feeling writing with this nib. It feels like it's writing dry, but it's not very feedbacky. It's pretty smooth, but I just don't feel like I'm getting the amount of ink that I am with the other nibs. And the little ink smear doesn't look that much different, but that could be partly because the ink is spread out over a wider line, that it gives it that drier feeling. I'm going to put feels dry. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. A little bit of a hard start there, and I think that's because there may have been just a tiny thin layer of ink dried on this nib. And that is just glassy smooth. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. And I had another hard start there. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier. I feel like this has a lot of ink up there in the feed, but the capillary action is pulling it backwards instead of forwards. Let me dip it again real quick. All right. That's not a very good indication of how this ink is going to perform under regular writing circumstances, but it does feel very nice in the nib. I would call it luxuriously smooth. While that dries, let's take a look at the writing sample on copy paper. Okay, on the 20-pound copy paper, in general, it felt nice. Writing with it felt nice in every single nib. Reverse writing with the Kaweco was very nice. My only issue is it's just a little bit too wet. The letters look a little ragged in the broader nibs. And in the finer nibs, you get like on the A, you get some areas of the letters that the ink tends to kind of blob up. Areas where you pause, just a fraction of a second pause will cause a ink blob. So it doesn't look terrible, but it's not the best. It's very pleasant to write with, but I would say the best looking of all of them is the extra fine because you don't get as much of that ink blobbing at pauses because you're working with so little ink to begin with. The bleed through was not terrible considering how wet of an ink this is and how dark it is. That's actually pretty good. I didn't mention at the beginning of the video, but teal and turquoise inks never show up accurately on camera. In real life, this ink is not quite as bright as it's showing up on camera, and that's one of the things I like about it. I mentioned in another video that this ink reminds me of Konpeki, but it's not as bright as Konpeki. That's always been one of the things with Konpeki is I love the color, but when I start writing with it, it's just a little too bright. So I wanted to compare it to Konpeki first, and yeah, that's true. They have the same type of sheen. Konpeki has that just a tiny bit of pink sheen, but it's like you took Konpeki and put a little bit of gray ink in it, or maybe this ink watered down might look a little more like Konpeki. And Sailor Manyo Sumire is very similar to Konpeki. So same thing there. Three Oysters Peacock Blue looks like a similar type of ink, but maybe instead of adding a little gray to it, you've added black. It's like a teal black color. I've always been very fond of this, but it's more of a work appropriate ink. But for some people, it might not be bright enough. So I feel like this gives you that same brightness that you get with Konpeki or Sumire, but it's not too bright. I was really impressed with the water resistance test, even in the extra fine nib. It's very legible after soaking in water for 10 minutes. And it looks like I'm still seeing some of that blue has hung around, but underneath that, it looks like there is a gray component to this ink that has some definite water resistance. Okay. On this writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, there's definitely some show through, and especially on the heavier sections, but there's no bleed through. I'm not seeing any of that sheen in the writing, even with the really wetter nibs. I'm seeing a little bit of shading in the broad nib, and if the stub nib would have written correctly, you probably would have seen it there too. In the Perkeo, in the medium, I'm seeing some shading. I think my two favorite nibs were the Pilot Extra Fine. I really like that legibility, but it doesn't jump out at you as being anything too wild, but you do notice there's something different about it. And the Pro Gear Slim, I was impressed with how it improved the writing experience that I normally have with that pen. All right, another thing I really liked about this ink is it matches my new ink journal. The cover of my Hobonichi Techo is, they call it a denim blue, and it's kind of a muted turquoisey teal color, a dark turquoisey teal, and the interior of it's brown. But this denim color is a nice match for this Noodler's navy. It may not appear so on camera, but in real life it is. I'm kind of a fan of that color. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.